This White House's lack of transparency, I have little faith that this so-called transcript reflects the totality of the conversation. But what they did release was shocking enough. He clearly pressured the Ukrainian government to investigate former Vice President Biden for his own political benefit, mentioning the Attorney General of the United States or his personal lawyer 6 times. Using the levers of state, the president sought to weaponize the Justice Department to pursue a personal political vendetta. We now know that for more than 2 months, the president urged Ukraine to investigate a political opponent while holding $391 million in urgently needed security assistance Congress appropriated to support U.S. national security interests. In fact, Congress approved this security assistance, including $141.5 million from the U.S. State Department and $250 million from Pentagon, with overwhelming bipartisan support. Indeed, for years now, Republicans and Democrats have come together to offer America support to Ukraine in the face of relentless Russian aggression. We have stood together with Ukraine because we know what is at stake. Our friends in Ukraine sit on the front lines of a struggle against the Kremlin's vision of a world that is not guided by democratic values or governed by the rule of law, but instead ruled by Putin and his corrupt cabal of oligarchs. Together, Democrats and Republicans have stood behind a free and independent Ukraine because together we stand behind our shared values of freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. We have stood in support of Ukraine in pursuit of our own strategic interests in the region. That's why we came together when Russian forces illegally invaded Crimea in 2014 and worked to bolster American support of Ukrainian sovereignty. I was proud of that moment as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time that we passed the Ukraine Freedom Support Act with strong bipartisan support. In an era of growing political divides, our support for a democratic, free, and sovereign Ukraine inspired us to transcend partisanship and to work together in common cause. And I applaud my Republican colleagues who have worked on these efforts, who have traveled to Ukraine, who have been strong advocates for our partners standing up against Kremlin aggression. That's why it's all the more puzzling that Republicans have largely been silent over the past few days. Whatever happened to solidarity with Ukraine? Whatever happened to standing up to Russia? Whatever happened to putting the national security of the United States ahead of petty partisan politics? We have found ourselves with a president in the White House who has now sought to manipulate aid to Ukraine to advance his own personal political agenda. Let's examine what we know. President Trump admitted that he spoke with President Zelensky and raised the issue of investigating the family of Vice President Biden. That was included in today's so-called transcript of the congratulatory call with President Zelensky. We know that after Congress appropriated this funding, the Department of State sent a notification to the White House Office of Budget and Management on June the 21st. We know that deliberations over this kind of funding typically just takes 5 days. Instead, the White House sat on this funding for 2 whole months. My staff met with the State Department last Friday. We tried to glean what could be the cause for this delay. Did the department have an objection to this money moving forward? No, they did not. Did they know why the White House sat on it for 2 months? No, they did not. Did the White House ask them any substantive questions on the security assistance to Ukraine over these months? No, they did not, and neither did the Defense Department. In other words, the State Department was unaware of any policy motivation that could have delayed the dispersal of urgently needed security funding to Ukraine. There was no policy motivation. On the contrary, the revelations of the past few days suggest a political motivation. It appears that President Trump's willingness to use the powers of his office for grossly inappropriate behavior on the international stage is pretty vivid. So we need to know exactly who in the Trump administration played a role in the improper withholding of congressionally appropriated funding for Ukraine and how. That's why today, Mr. President, I'm calling for unanimous consent for my bill the Ukraine Freedom, Assistance, Integrity, and Accountability Act of 2019. The bill would require an Inspector General of State Department investigation into the Office of Budget and Management's delay in obligating these funds. My legislation would require the State Department to share all records in its role in facilitating the President's personal lawyer's engagement with the Ukrainian government. It would require the administration obligate all Ukrainian security assistance funds and authorize additional funds to counter Russia malign influence across Europe. And it would also express solidarity with the Ukrainian people by imposing new sanctions on Russia for its continued aggression in eastern Ukraine. Those sanctions would target Russia's shipping sector, oligarchs, and cyber attackers. Now, Mr. President, I want to be clear that I'm an advocate of regular order here in the Senate, but we are in a crisis. It is a crisis potentially of constitutional proportions, a crisis that goes to the heart of our democracy. And how we respond to it will forever define our willingness as a Congress to defend the rule of law and live up to our Article I responsibilities. President Trump has once again stood in the way of congressional efforts to support Ukraine and all of Europe in the face of Russian aggression. The administration had once again flouted the rule of law, this time when the acting director of national intelligence refusing to disclose to Congress the whistleblower complaint on President Trump's conversations with President Zelensky, and we don't know what more, as he is mandated to do so. It is time for this Congress to stand up for its Article I powers. We need to act quickly to send a message to the White House and to the Kremlin. If there's anything we've learned from President Trump, it's that lawlessness begets lawlessness. It's time for us to remind the American people and the world that the rule of law means something. We will not allow the corrupting of our national security assistance. We will now allow our relationship with Ukraine to become a political football, and we will not let the foreign policy of the United States be corrupted for campaign purposes. So for that reason, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Foreign Relations be discharged from further consideration of S. 2537, that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and pass, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, first of all, let me say I concur with the good senator from New Jersey that we should follow regular order. He, like myself, has spent